"Sir, stop right there." The voice cut across the marble lobby like a slammed door. Every head turned. A security guard's hand was already reaching toward a black man's shoulder, a man in his late 30s, wearing a jacket with sleeves that had been hemmed twice, carrying a canvas tool bag slung across his chest like it belonged to him more than his own name did. The revolving doors behind him kept spinning, pushing cool morning air into the lobby, but nobody moved to leave. Phones rose. A woman near the reception desk stopped mid-sentence. An elevator that had already begun to close reopened, and two men in suits stepped halfway out, unsure whether to watch or walk away. "I need you to open that bag," the guard said, louder now, performing for the room as much as speaking to the man in front of him. The man didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stood still, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the lobby, not for an exit, but for his daughter, who was supposed to be sitting exactly where he'd left her, on the bench by the window, drawing in her notebook. She was still there, 8 years old, small enough that her sneakers didn't touch the floor. She had stopped drawing. She was staring at her father with an expression that no 8-year-old should ever have to wear, the look of a child trying to understand why grown-ups were suddenly afraid of her dad. "Daddy?" she said, so quietly that only he heard it over the murmur spreading through the lobby. He didn't answer her yet. He couldn't, not until he understood what was happening. 30 seconds earlier, he had been walking toward the exit with his head down, already rehearsing how he'd explain another rejection to his daughter without letting his voice crack. Now he was standing in the center of attention, in a building that had just told him he wasn't good enough to work in it, being treated like a threat on his way out the door. And somewhere above the lobby, behind a wall of glass on the second floor, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit had just set down her coffee, watched the scene unfold for exactly 4 seconds, and started running. She didn't yet know his name. She didn't know what was in the bag. She didn't know that in less than an hour, she would be the one making a phone call she never expected to make, to a man who, at that exact moment, believed his morning couldn't get any worse. It was about to get worse before it got better. Much worse. But first, you need to understand who Marcus Whitfield was before any of this happened, and why a man who had already lost almost everything still refused to raise his voice in that lobby, even as strangers filmed him like he was already guilty of something. 3 years earlier, Marcus Whitfield owned a small repair shop 2 blocks off Delmont Avenue. The sign above the door was hand-painted, "Whitfield Build and Repair," because a real sign from a shop cost more than he could justify spending on himself. He fixed what other people gave up on: sagging porches, kitchen cabinets that wouldn't close right, wiring that sparked when it shouldn't, furniture that families couldn't afford to replace but couldn't bear to throw away either, because it had belonged to someone they'd lost. He was good at it, not loud about it, just good. Customers didn't come back because he was the cheapest option in town. They came back because when Marcus Whitfield told you a job would take 3 days, it took 3 days. When he said a repair would hold, it held. In a business built on broken promises, he never broke his. Then his wife, Renee, got sick. It started as fatigue she blamed on long shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Then it became something the doctors had a name for. And after that, the name didn't matter anymore, because all that mattered was time, and time ran out faster than either of them expected. Marcus spent 11 months driving her to appointments before work, working full days with his hands shaking from exhaustion, then driving back to sit beside her hospital bed until visiting hours ended. He kept the shop open the entire time. He never once told a customer that his wife was dying, because sympathy wasn't going to pay for her treatment, and he didn't want anyone's pity. He wanted the work. Renee passed away on a Tuesday in October. Their daughter, Nia, was 5 years old. The bills that followed weren't cruel by accident. They were simply what medical debt looks like in a country where a good man can work every day of his life and still end up owing more than he earns. Within a year, the shop closed. Within 2, the tools that had built his career sat boxed in a storage unit he could barely afford, because a man who fixes things for other people rarely thinks to ask anyone to fix things for him. Since then, Marcus had worked whatever kept food on the table. warehouse shifts that started before sunrise, furniture assembly gigs that paid by the piece, a brief stretch loading trucks at a distribution center until the contract ended and nobody renewed it. None of it was beneath him. He never let Nia hear him say a job was beneath him. But none of it was enough either. Not enough hours, not enough stability, not enough to stop the quiet arithmetic he did every night after she fell asleep, staring at a spreadsheet of numbers that never quite balanced. What kept him upright wasn't ambition. It was Nia. Every morning, he woke at 5:40, made her oatmeal the way she liked it, cinnamon, no sugar, because sugar made her jittery in class, and combed her hair into 2 neat braids while she talked about a dream she'd had, or a bug she'd found, or a question about why the sky changed color at night. He listened to all of it like it was the most important information in the world, because to him, it was every night before bed. She asked him the same question, "Did you have a good day, Daddy?" And every night, even on the days he'd been turned away from 3 different jobs, even on the days his bank account balance made his stomach hurt, he told her the truth in the gentlest way he could find it. "I had a day where I kept trying," he'd say. "That's a good day." She believed him. Children believe the people who never lie to them, even when the truth is hard. That morning, the morning that would end with security guards and a stranger's bag search in a marble lobby, had started like any other. Nia had slipped a folded piece of paper into the front pocket of his tool bag while he tied her shoelaces. "Don't read it yet," she'd said, very seriously, the way she said most important things. "Read it when you need it." He had promised he would wait. He had no idea how badly he would need it by the end of the day. Ashford Structural Group occupied 11 floors of glass in steel downtown, the kind of building where the elevators moved so smoothly you couldn't feel them start or stop. Marcus had applied for a facilities maintenance position. Steady hours, benefits. The kind of job that could finally let him stop calculating whether a dentist visit for Nia meant skipping groceries that week. He'd worn his one good shirt, ironed twice. He'd printed his resume on paper thicker than he could really afford, because he'd read somewhere that paper quality mattered to some people, and he wasn't going to let a detail like that cost him a chance. The interview lasted 11 minutes. The hiring manager, a clean-shaven man named Grant Kessler, who kept glancing at his watch even when Marcus was mid-sentence, flipped through the resume with the kind of speed that told you he'd already made up his mind before Marcus sat down. "You ran your own repair business," Kessler said. Not quite a question. 15 years, Marcus answered. "Carpentry, basic electrical, plumbing repairs, structural patchwork. I built a client base from nothing and kept every one of them until I closed." "Why'd you close it?" Marcus paused for exactly one breath. "Personal circumstances." Kessler didn't ask what circumstances. He didn't seem interested in the answer. He tapped his pen against a resume like it was a countdown clock. "The issue," Kessler said, "is that this role reports up through corporate facilities management. We're looking for someone with recent experience inside a structured management environment, reporting chains, compliance documentation, that sort of thing. Small independent contracting is a different skill set entirely. I manage vendors, invoicing, scheduling, safety compliance, and a small crew during my busiest years." Marcus said evenly, "That structure, it just didn't come with a company logo on it." Kessler smiled the way people smile when they've already decided not to be persuaded. "I appreciate that. We'll keep your resume on file." Marcus had heard that sentence enough times in the last 3 years to know exactly what it meant. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He shook Kessler's hand, thanked him for his time, and stood up before the disappointment could show on his face. Outside the conference room, standing at the elevator bank, he allowed himself exactly 4 seconds to feel the weight of it. The 11th rejection in 5 months, the mortgage payment due in 9 days, the growing certainty that no resume, no matter how carefully worded, could undo what people decided about him before he ever opened his mouth. Then he straightened his shoulders, because Neil was downstairs in the lobby, and children read their parents' faces the way meteorologists read the sky. She would know instantly if something was wrong, and he wasn't ready to explain it to her yet, not until he'd figure out how to say it gently. He stepped into the elevator. He had no idea that the real test of the day hadn't even started yet. Marcus found Nia exactly where he'd left her, cross-legged on the lobby bench, her backpack beside her, drawing something in a notebook she carried everywhere. She looked up the moment she saw him and immediately knew. "You didn't get it," she said. "Not a question." "Not this one," he said, crouching to her eye level. "But we keep trying. That's the deal, right?" "That's the deal," she echoed, though her small shoulders sagged a little, because she was old enough now to understand what "not this one" had started to mean for their family, for the apartment they might have to leave, for the winter coat she'd need soon that he hadn't figured out how to budget for yet. He slung his tool bag across his chest, the same worn canvas bag he'd carried into every interview for the last 5 months, because it held his references, his certifications, and, folded at the very bottom pocket, the note Nia had told him not to open yet. They started toward the revolving doors. That's when the guard stepped into their path. "Sir, I need you to stop for a second." Marcus stopped immediately, the way a man stops when he has spent his whole life understanding exactly how quickly a misunderstanding can turn dangerous for someone who looks like him. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his voice calm, controlled, the tone of a man who had learned long ago that calm was the only tool that ever worked in moments like this. "We had a report of a missing equipment bag from a 4th-floor IT department," the guard said, louder than necessary, already reaching for the strap of Marcus's tool bag. "Matches the description. I need to check it." "This bag is mine," Marcus said. "It's been mine for 15 years. It's got my tools and my paperwork in it. Nothing that came from this building." "I still need to check it," the guard repeated, and this time his hand actually closed around the strap. The lobby had gone quiet in that particular way public spaces go quiet right before something becomes a spectacle. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence. Footsteps slowing. Phones rising like a wave of small glowing rectangles. Marcus felt every eye in the room land on him at once. He looked down at Nia. She had gone very still, the way children go still when they sense danger before they can name it. Her hand found his sleeve and held on. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is he doing that?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He was willing to give an 8-year-old in front of a room full of strangers. So he gave her the only thing he had, steadiness. "It's okay, baby," he said, keeping his voice low and even, though his heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. "I haven't done anything wrong. We're going to let him check, and then we're going to go home." He unzipped the bag himself, slowly, deliberately, making sure every movement was visible, because he had learned, the way too many black fathers learn, passed down like an inheritance nobody asked for, that in moments like this, the difference between going home and not going home could come down to how carefully you move your hands. Inside the bag, a folded set of carpentry certifications, a small tool roll, a worn photograph of Renee tucked into a plastic sleeve, and, at the very bottom, a folded piece of paper he hadn't opened yet. Nothing that belonged to Ashford's structural group, nothing that matched a missing IT equipment bag in any conceivable way. The guard's radio crackled. Another voice, the supervisor, came through, tinny and distant. "Copy that. Bags confirmed recovered on 4. False alarm." The guard's face didn't change much. He didn't apologize. He simply said, "All right, you're clear," and stepped back, already turning away, already moving on to whatever came next in his shift, as though he hadn't just stopped a father in front of his daughter in a lobby full of strangers over a mistake that had been resolved in less time than it took to make it happen. Marcus zipped the bag, closed with hands that were not quite steady. Around him, the phones lowered. The conversations resumed. The moment that felt enormous to him had already begun shrinking in everyone else's memory, the way public humiliations always do for everyone except the person standing at the center of them. Nia hadn't let go of his sleeve. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. "No, baby," Marcus said, and knelt down so she could see his face clearly, so she could see that he meant it. "We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people make mistakes about other people. It's not about you and it's not about me. It's about them not looking closely enough before they decide something. It was the kind of explanation a father gives a child when he doesn't yet have the words for how much it actually costs him to say it so gently. He took her hand and walked toward the revolving doors, his pulse still hammering, his dignity intact but bruised, his interview rejection now sitting underneath a fresh layer of humiliation he hadn't asked for and hadn't deserved. He didn't look back at the guard. He didn't look for an apology. He had learned that chasing an apology from someone who didn't think they owed you one only cost you more energy than you had left to spend. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that 2 floors up, behind a wall of glass, a woman named Diane Ashford had watched the entire scene unfold from the moment the guard's hand closed on the strap. She hadn't heard a single word of it, but she had seen exactly how Marcus Whitfield had moved, slowly, carefully, protectively positioning himself between his daughter and the guard without ever raising his voice. She had seen him kneel down afterward, not to comfort himself, but to make sure his daughter didn't carry the moment as fear. She set her coffee down. She was already moving toward the stairwell before she'd fully decided to. Marcus and Nia had barely reached the corner when his phone rang. Unknown number. Area code local to Nia's elementary school. His stomach dropped before he even answered. Mr. Whitfield? The voice was calm but urgent. The practiced calm of a school nurse who has made this exact call many times and knows exactly how much reassurance to pack into the first sentence. This is Nurse Patterson at Lincoln Elementary. I need to let you know that your daughter, Nia's right here with me, Marcus said, confused, glancing down at Nia, who was staring up at him with wide, worried eyes, hearing only his half of the conversation. A pause. I'm sorry. Did you say Nia's with you? We have a health record calling in reference to your son, Marcus Jr. I don't have a son, Marcus said slowly. You may have the wrong Whitfield. Another pause, longer this time, and then an apology, quick and professional, the kind that comes with particular embarrassment of a wrong number mistake made in a moment that already felt too heavy to hold one more thing. Marcus hung up. His hands were shaking. Not from the call itself, but from the 10 seconds between hearing your daughter and realizing it was a mistake. 10 seconds in which every parent's worst fear had detonated inside his chest for no reason at all. He knelt down in front of Nia again, right there on the sidewalk, and pulled her into a hug he hadn't planned on needing. What happened? She asked into his shoulder. Nothing, he said, and for the first time that day, his voice actually cracked a little. Nothing happened. I just needed to make sure. It was in its own strange way the moment that broke something loose in him. Not the guard, not the interview, not the 11 minutes Grant Kessler had spent deciding he wasn't worth hiring, but this, the 10 seconds of pure terror over a wrong number layered on top of everything else the morning had already taken from him. He sat down on a bus bench, Nia curled against his side, and for just a moment, he let himself feel the full weight of the day instead of holding it at arm's length the way he usually did for her sake. That's when he remembered the note. He reached into the bottom pocket of his tool bag and pulled out the small folded paper Nia had slipped in that morning. He'd promised to wait until he needed it. He needed it now. He unfolded it carefully. Nia's handwriting. Still learning its shape. Still leaning slightly to the right the way 7- and 8-year-olds' letters do before they've fully settled. Good luck, Daddy. Even if they say no, you're still the best dad in the whole world. I know you'll find the right place. Love, Nia. Marcus read it twice. Then he folded it again, carefully, and tucked it into his shirt pocket, over his heart, the way you keep the things that matter most where you can feel them. You okay, Daddy? Nia asked, watching him. Yeah, baby, he said, and this time when he smiled, it was real. I'm okay. He didn't know it yet, but 3 floors above the marble lobby he just walked out of, a woman was standing in front of an HR director, asking a question that was about to change both of their lives. Did that man already leave? Diane Ashford had built Ashford Structural Group from a 4-person contracting outfit into one of the largest commercial construction and facilities firms in the state over the course of 22 years. She hadn't inherited the company. She'd built it with a business degree, a small loan, and an almost obsessive belief that the people doing the actual physical work, the electricians, the welders, the maintenance crews, were the true foundation of everything the company claimed to stand for, even when the org chart didn't always reflect that belief. She rarely sat in on interviews. She trusted her department heads to make good decisions, and micromanaging every hire for an 11-floor company would have meant doing nothing else with her time. But she had seen the lobby. She hadn't heard a word of what was said between the guard and the man in the worn jacket. She hadn't needed to. She had seen enough. The guard's hand closing on the strap before any explanation was offered. The way the man had positioned his body slightly in front of his daughter, without ever looking aggressive. The way he had knelt afterward not to compose himself, but to reassure a child who clearly needed reassuring more than he did. Most people, cleared of a false accusation in a public lobby, leave angry. Some leave loudly. A few threaten to call a lawyer, and a few of those actually do. This man had simply zipped his bag, taken his daughter's hand, and walked out without a single raised word. That kind of composure isn't rehearsed. It's built, slowly, painfully, over years of learning that composure is sometimes the only thing standing between you and a much worse outcome. Diane found Grant Kessler in the fourth-floor break room, refilling his coffee, already halfway through describing his morning to a colleague. The 10:15 candidate, Diane said, cutting straight through the small talk. Whitfield, where's his file? Kessler blinked, clearly caught off guard by the CEO herself asking about a maintenance-level applicant. I passed on him. Independent contractor background, no corporate experience. Wasn't a fit. I'd like to see the file anyway. Of course, Kessler said, already pulling it up. Though something his posture suggested, he considered this an unusual and slightly unnecessary use of the CEO's morning. Diane read through the resume standing at his desk. 15 years running an independent repair business. Carpentry, electrical, plumbing, structural patchwork. A client base built entirely through word of mouth and kept intact for over a decade. A detail that, to anyone who understood service industries, said more about reliability than any corporate title ever could. Then she reached the attachments. Buried behind the standard references was a handwritten letter, slightly creased from having been folded and unfolded many times, printed on a letterhead of Community Shelter 3 neighborhoods over. To whom it may concern, Mr. Marcus Whitfield repaired our children's wing after severe flooding damaged the ceiling, wiring, and flooring throughout the entire East Hall. He completed the work in 11 days, working many of those evenings after his own paying jobs had ended, and refused any payment for his labor, saying only that the family staying with us needed the money more than he did. In the 4 years since, he has returned every winter, without being asked, to check and repair our heating systems free of charge. I have met very few people in my career whose character matches their skill so completely. It was signed by the shelter's director. Diane turned to the next page. A second letter shorter, from an elderly woman 2 streets from Marcus's old shop, describing how he had rebuilt her porch railing after she'd fallen and broken her wrist, and had refused to charge her because she was on fixed income. Then had come back twice more that year, unprompted, to check that the repair was still holding before the first snow. A third letter. A fourth. None of it had come up in the 11-minute interview, because nobody had asked. Diane closed the folder slowly. He worked with us today, Kessler said, a little defensively now, sensing the direction of the silence. 15 minutes at most. We covered the requirements. He simply doesn't have the corporate management background the role needs. The role needs someone people trust, Diane said. Someone reliable enough that an entire neighborhood writes letters on his behalf without being asked to. That's not something you find on a management certification, Grant. That's something you find by actually looking. She held up the folder. Did anyone in that interview ask him a single question about any of this? Kessler didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Find him, Diane said. Find out where he is right now. He's probably long gone, Kessler said. It's been almost 40 minutes. Then I hope he hasn't gone too far, Diane said, already walking toward the elevator. already pulling her phone from her pocket. Because I think we owe him a conversation nobody bothered to have the first time. Marcus and Nia were 3 blocks from home when his phone rang again. Unknown number. This time with a different area code. The one for downtown. The one belonging to the building he just walked out of twice in 1 hour. He almost let it go to voicemail. He was tired. Neil was tired. He had a bus transfer catch and a mortgage payment circling in his head like a vulture. And he didn't have room left that day for one more disappointment delivered politely over the phone. But something made him answer. "Hello, Mr. Whitfield? This is Diane Ashford. I'm the CEO at Ashford Structural Group." Marcus stopped walking. Nia stopped beside him, looking up, trying to read his face the way she always did. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "I think there's some confusion. I interviewed there this morning. It didn't go anywhere." "I know," Diane said. "I'd like to ask you to come back, if you're willing." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Not hope, exactly, not yet. More like wariness. He had learned, the hard way, that surprise phone calls from powerful people rarely ended the way you hoped they would. "With respect, Ms. Ashford," he said, "I don't think another interview is going to change the outcome. I was told this morning that my experience wasn't the right fit." "It isn't another interview," Diane said. "I think we asked the wrong questions the first time. I'd like the chance to ask better ones. And I owe you an apology for what happened in the lobby on top of that." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Down the block, a bus he could have caught rolled past without stopping, and he let it go. "You saw that?" he asked. "I saw enough of it," Diane said. "I saw how you handled it. That's actually part why I'm calling." Marcus looked down at Nia, who was watching him with particular patience children develop. When they've learned to wait through adult conversations they don't fully understand yet. He thought about the mortgage payment due in 9 days. He thought about 11 rejections in 5 months. He thought about the note folded in his shirt pocket, over his heart. "Even if they say no, you're still the best dad in the whole world." "I can be there in 20 minutes, he said. "Take your time," Diane said. "We'll be here." He hung up and crouched down in front of Nia, his heart pounding for an entirely different reason than it had an hour earlier. "Change of plans, baby," he said. "We're going back." "Are you going to get the job?" she asked, wide-eyed. "I don't know yet," Marcus said honestly, because he had never once lied to her about outcomes, only about how afraid he was while waiting for them. But somebody wants to actually listen this time. That's worth going back for. When Marcus returned to the Ashford Structural Group lobby for the second time that day, the guard who had stopped him earlier was nowhere in sight, and a different receptionist waved him through with an apologetic softness that suggested word of the morning's incident had already traveled through the building. Diane Ashford was waiting near the elevators herself, which surprised him. CEOs, in his limited experience with corporate buildings, did not typically meet job applicants at elevators. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming back. And I owe you a direct apology for the lobby. That should never have happened, and it especially should never have happened in front of your daughter." Marcus shook her hand. "I appreciate you saying that. Most people in your position wouldn't have." "Most people in my position weren't watching from the second floor," Diane said. I saw the whole thing." She glanced down at Nia, who had followed her father inside, clutching her notebook against her chest. "You must be Nia," Diane said, crouching slightly to her eye level, the same instinct Marcus used constantly and recognized instantly in someone else. "Your dad kept it together really well back there. That's not easy to do." Nia looked up at her father, then back at Diane, and said with the blunt honesty only children reliably offer, "He always keeps it together, even when I know he's not okay." Something shifted in Diane's expression, brief, unreadable, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Come on," she said, straightening up. "I want to show you something before we talk." Instead of leading Marcus toward the conference room where his interview had taken place that morning, Diane guided him and Nia toward a service elevator, down to the building's lower level, into a part of Ashford Structural Group that visitors rarely saw, the maintenance workshop, where the company's electricians, welders, painters, and repair crews actually kept the building running. The space smelled like sawdust and machine oil, familiar in a way that settled something in Marcus's chest he hadn't realized was tense. "This is our facilities division," Diane said. 23 people keep every system in this building running. Electrical, HVAC, structural repairs, general maintenance. The position you interviewed for this morning oversees this crew. She introduced him to a few of the workers as they passed. A welder named Torres, a young electrical apprentice named Devin, who couldn't have been more than 22, an older mechanic named Ruth who barely looked up from the panel she was rewiring. Marcus noticed things as they walked. A loading dock door that stuck slightly on its hinges, the kind of small persistent problem that gets ignored for months because nobody has time to fix the root cause instead of the symptom. A rattling ventilation grate that everyone had clearly learned to tune out. He didn't say anything at first. It wasn't his place to comment on someone else's building without being asked. But when they passed the loading dock a second time, and the door stuck again with the same metallic groan, Marcus finally spoke. "Mind if I take a look at that?" he asked Diane. "Please," she said. He crouched down, running his hand along the hinge, tilting his head to examine the alignment. Within 30 seconds, he had identified the problem. The frame shifted slightly out of square, probably from foot traffic vibration over time, he said. The hinge itself is fine. Somebody's probably been oiling it every few weeks to buy time, which works for a while, but it's a frame issue, not a hinge issue. You need to reset the alignment, not just lubricate it. Torres, the welder, had wandered over, arms crossed, listening. "That's exactly what I told facilities 6 months ago," he said. "Nobody believed me because I'm not the maintenance lead." "You were right," Marcus said simply. Devin, the young apprentice, had drifted closer to, curious. A moment later, he fumbled a laser measuring tool he'd been carrying, and it clattered to the concrete floor. His face went pale immediately. The particular fear of a young employee certain he's about to be reprimanded in front of the CEO herself. I'm sorry. I'll pay for it if it's broken. Hey," Marcus said, before anyone else could react, kneeling down and picking up the tool, turning it over carefully to check the casing. "Breathe. It's fine, the casing's intact. Nothing's cracked." Devin exhaled shakily. "I thought I was going to get fired." "You know what actually gets people fired?" Marcus said, handing the tool back to him. "Not dropping something. Everybody drops something eventually. What gets people fired is pretending they didn't, and letting someone else find out the hard way when the tool fails on the job. You told the truth the second it happened. That's the part that matters." Devin nodded slowly, something visibly loosening in his shoulders. Diane hadn't said a word through any of it. She had simply watched the loading dock door, the apprentice's drop tool, the way Marcus moved through a space full of strangers like someone who belonged there, not because of a title, but because of instinct. Nia had wandered a little ways off, sketching the workshop in her notebook. Ruth's tool cart, a stack of coiled wire, her father crouched by the door. She was used to sitting quietly in spaces like this, waiting for her father to finish work. He couldn't help but do, even when nobody had asked him to. "You didn't have to fix that door," Diane said quietly once Marcus stood back up. "Habit," Marcus said. "If I see something broken, I fix it. That's not something I turn off just because I'm not being paid yet. That," Diane said, "is exactly the problem I've been trying to solve for 2 years." They ended up in a small break room instead of a conference room. Diane's choice deliberate, because she wanted this conversation to feel nothing like the one Grant Kessler had conducted that morning. Nia sat at a nearby table, drawing, close enough to hear but absorbed enough in her notebook not to need to. "Our facilities division has the highest turnover rate of any department in the company," Diane said, sliding a folder across the table. Not a resume this time, but internal data. Charts, exit interview summaries. We've cycled through 4 maintenance supervisors in 3 years. Every single one of them was hired for management credentials. Every single one of them lost the trust of the crew within 6 months. Marcus looked through the pages slowly. "Why?" Because management on paper and leadership on the ground are two different skill sets, Diane said. The people who worked under those supervisors didn't quit because the supervisors couldn't read a compliance report. They quit because none of them ever earned trust. They gave orders. They didn't listen. They didn't get down on the floor and actually look at what was broken. She nodded toward the workshop beyond the break room door. You've been in this building for less than 20 minutes, and you've already fixed a problem that's been reported and ignored for 6 months. Calmed down a terrified 22-year-old, and earned Torres's respect, which I promise you is not easy to earn. Marcus said nothing, waiting. I'm not offering you the position you interviewed for this morning, Diane continued. Marcus felt something drop in his chest. Quiet and familiar, the shape disappointment always took by now. I'm offering you a different one, Diane said. Director of Facilities Operations. You'd oversee the entire crew, hiring, training, day-to-day operations, safety compliance. It comes with a higher salary than the position you interviewed for, full health coverage and flexible scheduling. Because I understand you're raising your daughter on your own, and I'm not interested in building a role that makes that harder for you. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. Why me? Diane didn't answer immediately. She reached into the folder and pulled out the handwritten letter from the shelter director. The one about the flooding repairs Marcus had refused to bill for. Because after you were told no this morning, she said, in front of your daughter, after you were publicly and wrongly accused of theft an hour later, you still fixed a stuck door on your way through a building that had just embarrassed you twice, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. That tells me more about how you lead a crew than any interview question ever could. Marcus looked down at the letter in her hand, his own handwriting on the shelter's guest log. Faded now, for years old, a job he'd taken because the director had asked him quietly if he had any time to spare, not because anyone was ever supposed to read about it in a hiring folder. I never told anyone about that job, he said quietly. I didn't do it to get credit. I know, Diane said. That's exactly why it matters. Nia had stopped drawing. She was watching the conversation now, her small hand still, her eyes moving between her father and the woman across the table with particular sharpness children have when they sense something important is happening, even if they can't name exactly what. I can't promise this will be easy, Diane said. The crew has been let down 4 times in 3 years. You'll have to earn their trust the same way you earned Torres's in the last 20 minutes, one honest interaction at a time. I also can't offer you a salary above what I've outlined. I won't inflate it just because of this morning. I'd rather offer you a fair number and a real position than a guilty number and an empty title. Marcus looked at the paperwork in front of him. Director of Facilities Operations. A number beside it that was more than he'd made in the 3 best months of his old shop combined. Full health coverage. The kind that would have changed everything during Renee's illness. The kind he still thought about every time Nia caught a cold, and he calculated whether the pharmacy visit could wait until payday. He thought about the guard's hand closing on his bag strap. He thought about Grant Kessler's 11 minutes. He thought about the note in his shirt pocket. I'll take it, he said. Good, Diane said, and for the first time since they'd met, she smiled, not the practiced smile of closing a deal, but something quieter, more like relief. Because I think this building has been needing you longer than either of us realized. Word of what happened in the lobby that morning had already started moving through Ashford's structural group by the time Marcus's first day officially began 2 weeks later. Not because Diane had made an announcement, but because in any building with security cameras and gossiping employees, some stories find their own way to travel. The security guard who had stopped Marcus, a man named Owens who had worked for the building's contracted security firm for 6 years, was called into a meeting with both Diane and the head of the security contract company during Marcus's first week. Diane hadn't wanted him fired outright, she believed, and said plainly that punishment without understanding rarely changes anything. But she also wasn't willing to let the incident disappear quietly, the way these incidents so often do. Walk me through what made you stop him specifically, Diane said, in a conversation Marcus wasn't present for, but heard about secondhand, weeks later, from someone in HR who thought he deserved to know. Owens had struggled to answer. The description of the missing bag had been vague, dark-colored, canvas material, worn straps. It could describe the dozen bags in that lobby on any given morning. He hadn't stopped anyone else that day matching a similarly vague description. "I need you to sit with that answer," Diane had told him, "because I think you already know what it is, even if it's uncomfortable to say out loud." Owens wasn't fired. He was required to complete a retraining program focused specifically on bias awareness and de-escalation, and Diane made a policy change that week requiring any bag check request to be confirmed against actual item descriptions, brand, size, contents, before a guard to stop anyone, rather than relying on vague radio calls. It wasn't a dramatic public reckoning. It was a quiet, structural fix, the kind that doesn't make headlines but changes what happens to the next person who walks through that lobby. Grant Kessler's reckoning was slower and less forgiving. Diane pulled the hiring records for Facilities Division going back 3 years and found a pattern that troubled her more than she let on in the moment. A disproportionate number of qualified independent contractors and tradespeople, several of them people of color, rejected within the first 15 minutes of interviews, always for the same phrase: not the right fit for a structured corporate environment. Meanwhile, candidates with far less hands-on experience but more traditional corporate resumes had been hired and had left within the year. Exactly the turnover pattern Diane had shown Marcus that first afternoon. She didn't fire Kessler either, not immediately, not publicly, not as a spectacle. But she removed him from the hiring process of the Facilities Division entirely, required him to sit through the same bias training Owens completed, and made it clear in a private conversation neither of them ever spoke about outside that room, that his job now depended on demonstrating he could actually see the people in front of him instead of the assumptions he brought into the room before they'd said a word. Marcus never asked for any of this. He found out about most of it after the fact, in fragments, from people who wanted him to know the company was trying to be better, not just to him, but to whoever came after him. "You could have pushed for more," Torres told him one afternoon, a few months in, as they worked together repairing a section of wiring on the 3rd floor. "Guy nearly had you in real trouble over nothing. Could have gotten him fired outright if you'd made a stink." Marcus considered that for a moment, tightening a connection with careful, practiced hands. "Getting him fired doesn't fix the reason he did it in the first place," he said. "I'd rather he learn something than just disappear and get replaced by somebody who does the exact same thing to the next guy." Torres didn't have a response to that. He just nodded slowly, the way people do when they've heard something they weren't quite expecting from a man they were still getting to know. The first 3 months weren't easy. Diane had been honest about that from the beginning, and she'd been right. The facility's crew had been burned by 4 different supervisors in 3 years, and trust doesn't rebuild itself just because a new person seems well-intentioned. Ruth, the mechanic who'd barely looked up during Marcus's first tour of the workshop, kept her distance for weeks, answering questions politely but briefly. The professional courtesy of someone who has learned not to invest emotionally in a leader who might not last. Marcus didn't push. He'd learned, over 15 years of running his own business, that trust wasn't something you could demand. You could only make it easy for people to give, over time, by doing exactly what you said you'd do, over and over, until the pattern became undeniable. He learned every name on the crew within his first week, not just names, but details. Devin, the young apprentice, was saving up to help his mother with rent while finishing a community college electrical program at night. Ruth had been doing this work for 18 years and had trained more supervisors than she could count, most of whom had never once asked her opinion on anything. Torres had a daughter close to Nia's age and had missed her last 2 birthdays because of mandatory overtime nobody had bothered to schedule around. Marcus started doing something none of the previous supervisors had done. He asked questions and then actually acted on the answers. He restructured the overtime rotation, so no one missed the same family event twice in a row. He fixed the broken bench in the break room that everyone had been complaining about for over a year, staying 2 hours after his shift on a Tuesday to do it himself, because he understood that people eat lunch faster and worse when they don't have anywhere comfortable to sit, and tired, rushed people make more mistakes. He started weekly 10-minute check-ins with each member of the crew, not performance reviews, just conversations. What's working? What isn't? What nobody upstairs has bothered to ask about. Slowly, the crew began to change around him. Ruth was the first to soften, in her own quiet way. She started leaving small notes on the maintenance log pointing out issues before he even had to ask. The kind of unprompted initiative that only shows up once someone believes their effort will actually be noticed. Devin asked Marcus, hesitantly, one afternoon, whether he'd be willing to look over his electrical coursework, because none of his previous supervisors had ever offered, and he didn't want to seem like he was asking for special treatment. That's not special treatment, Marcus told him. That's just somebody with more experience helping somebody with less. That's how the trade's supposed to work. He started staying an extra 30 minutes twice a week to go through Devin's coursework with him, the same patient. Unhurried instruction he used with Nia when she brought home a math worksheet she didn't understand. 6 months in, Diane pulled the turnover data again, the same report she'd shown Marcus that first afternoon in the break room. The facility's division's turnover rate had dropped by nearly half. Not because Marcus had implemented a new policy manual or introduced stricter compliance tracking or done any of the things a traditional corporate hire might have prioritized. He'd simply done what he'd always done, shown up, listened, fixed what was broken, and treated every person on that crew like their name and their story actually mattered. I've never seen numbers move like this from something this simple, Diane told him during one of their now regular check-ins. It's not that simple, Marcus said. It just doesn't look complicated from the outside. People don't leave jobs because the work is hard. Most people I know can handle hard work. They leave because nobody ever makes them feel like they matter while they're doing it. Devin's story became, in its own quiet way, one of the moments Marcus would remember longest from that first year. He was 22, the youngest member of the crew, working days as an apprentice electrician, while attending night classes toward his certification, splitting his paycheck between his own rent and helping his mother, who had raised him alone after his father left when he was 6. Marcus recognized pieces of himself in Devin almost immediately, not because their circumstances were identical, but because he recognized the particular exhaustion of a young man trying to build something stable out of very little, with nobody standing behind him to catch him if he stumbled. 3 months into Marcus's new role, Devin made a mistake. A real one, not a drop tool. He mislabeled a circuit during a routine panel inspection, an error that could have caused a serious problem if it hadn't been caught during a follow-up check 2 days later. The old supervisors, according to Ruth and Torres, would have written him up immediately, possibly recommended termination, definitely made an example of him in front of the crew. Marcus called Devin into his office instead, a small, unglamorous room off the workshop that Diane had offered to upgrade and that Marcus had declined because he didn't need anything fancier than a desk and 2 chairs to have an honest conversation. Devin sat down, already braced for the worst, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I know what I did," he said, before Marcus could say anything. "I know it was serious. I'll take whatever's coming." "I want to hear what happened first," Marcus said, "not to catch you in something. I actually want to understand." Devin explained. He'd been rushing between 2 jobs that day, covering for a co-worker out sick, tried to finish the inspection before his night class started, and he'd mislabeled the circuit in the confusion. "Here's what I know," Marcus said once Devin had finished. "You made a mistake because you were stretched too thin, not because you don't know your work. That's on scheduling as much as it's on you, and scheduling is my responsibility, not yours. But I also need you to understand, in this line of work, a mistake like this isn't just a mistake. It's somebody's safety. That has to matter to you every single time, even when you're tired, even when you're rushing." "I understand," Devin said quietly. "I really do." "I believe you," Marcus said. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm not writing you up. I'm restructuring the coverage schedule, so you're not carrying 2 people's workload during finals week again. And I want you to walk me through every panel inspection you do for the next month out loud before you sign off on it. Not because I don't trust you, because I want you to build a habit of slowing down every single time, no matter how tired you are. That habit is going to keep you and everyone around you safe for the next 30 years of your career. Devin looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. The particular disbelief of someone who has been braced for punishment his whole life and doesn't quite know what to do when he's offered accountability instead. "Why are you doing this?" Devin asked. "The others would have fired me over this." "Because somebody did this for me once, a long time ago, before I had my own shop," Marcus said. "An older electrician caught a mistake I made on a job and could have reported me to client and ended my career before it started. Instead, he sat me down, told me exactly what I'd done wrong, and gave me a chance to prove I'd actually learned something. I never forgot it. Figured I'd pass it along when I got the chance." Devin didn't say much after that. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, stood up, and went back to work. And over the following weeks, Torres and Ruth both noticed something different in him. He asked more questions. He double-checked his work without being told to. He stayed late unprompted to review coursework with Marcus, determined to close the gap between what he knew and what the job demanded of him. By the end of the year, Devin had passed the certification exam. Marcus attended the small evening ceremony at the community college, sitting in the third row beside Nia, who had insisted on coming because, in her words, "Devin's basically my other older brother now." Devin spotted him in the crowd when his name was called, and for just a moment, before he could stop himself, grinned wide enough that the whole row saw it. Marcus clapped until his hands hurt. By the end of Marcus's first year as Director of Facilities Operations, the changes had moved beyond the workshop and into the rest of Ashford's structural group. Diane began quietly incorporating pieces of what she'd learned watching Marcus work into broader company policy, not because she wanted to take credit for his instincts, but because she recognized, with the clarity of someone who had spent 2 decades trying to solve a problem she couldn't quite name, that it solved something she'd been circling for years. The most significant change came after Marcus, several months into the role, brought a proposal to Diane that he'd been quietly developing on his own time. "I want to talk to you about something," he said, during one of their regular check-ins. "It's not about my department specifically. It's about something bigger." He explained it plainly. During his years running his own shop, he'd watched Renee struggle to balance her hospital shifts with caring for a sick relative before her own diagnosis, and later, he'd watched himself try to hold together a business while she was dying, with no formal support system to lean on, because independent contractors and hourly employees rarely have access to real family leave. "A lot of the crew doesn't have the flexibility that salaried employees upstairs have," Marcus said. "If Ruth's mother gets sick or Torres's daughter needs surgery or Devin's mom has an emergency, they're choosing between their paycheck and their family. I live that choice. I know exactly how it feels, and I don't think anyone in this building should have to make it if we can help it." Diane listened without interrupting, the way she'd learned to listen to Marcus over the past several months, because she'd come to understand that his quiet pauses usually meant he was building towards something worth waiting for. "I'd like to propose an emergency family leave program for hourly employees," Marcus continued. "Not unlimited, not unrealistic for the business, but real, paid, protected time for genuine family emergencies, the kind that don't wait for open enrollment or 2 weeks' notice." Diane took the proposal to the board 3 weeks later. It wasn't an easy sell. Some board members raised concerns about cost, about precedent, about what it might mean company-wide if extended beyond facilities. But Diane, armed with the turnover data Marcus's leadership had already produced, made the case plainly. The cost of losing and retraining hourly workers had been higher for years than the cost of supporting them properly ever would be. The policy passed, in a modified form, 6 months later, extended not just to the facilities division but company-wide, one of the first programs of its kind among the company's competitors in the region. Marcus didn't take credit for it publicly. When a local business journal ran a short piece on Ashford Structural Group's new employee benefits, quoting Diane, he read it quietly at his kitchen table one evening, while Nia did her homework across from him, and said nothing about his own role in it to anyone at work. But Ruth mentioned it to him a week later, almost in passing, while they worked together on a repair. Heard the new leave policy came from you, she said, not looking up from the panel she was tightening. Heard wrong, Marcus said, smiling slightly. Ruth said, unconvinced, and left it there. But from that day on, something in how she worked beside him shifted, a final layer of quiet trust settling into place that no policy on paper could have manufactured on its own. There was one more thread from that first difficult day that Marcus never forgot, though it had nothing to do with the lobby, the guard, or the interview itself. Weeks before the incident that changed everything, back during one of his earlier, unsuccessful interviews at a different downtown building, Marcus had crossed paths with an older janitor named Curtis, whose cleaning cart had tipped over near the entrance ramp, scattering papers and equipment across the polished floor. Without thinking twice, Marcus had knelt down to help gather the scattered maintenance reports before anyone could step on them, picked up a broken mop clip, and tightened a loose wheel on the cart using the small screwdriver he always carried in his jacket pocket. Didn't get the job? Curtis had asked, watching him work. No, Marcus had admitted. You still stopped to help, Curtis said. Someone had to, Marcus had said simply, and moved on with his day, thinking nothing more of it. He hadn't remembered to mention it to anyone. Not because it wasn't meaningful to him, but because helping people wasn't something Marcus kept a ledger of. It was simply how he moved through the world, whether or not anyone was watching, whether or not it ever came back around to matter. Almost a year later, not long after Marcus had settled fully into his new role at Ashford Structural Group, he was walking through the building's lower-level maintenance corridor and nearly collided with a familiar face. Curtis, now wearing an Ashford Structural Group uniform, carrying a clipboard instead of a mop. Well, I'll be, Curtis said, breaking into a wide grin. Looks like somebody finally noticed you, too. Marcus laughed, genuinely surprised. What are you doing here? It turned out that months earlier, Marcus, without fully realizing the weight of what he was doing, had mentioned Curtis's name in passing to Diane during one of their early conversations about staffing needs across the building's facilities network, describing him simply as one of the most reliable, quietly hard-working people he'd ever crossed paths with. Diane had quietly followed up, tracked Curtis down through his previous employer, and offered him a position as a facilities advisor within Ashford's broader maintenance network, a real promotion, with better pay and benefits than the janitorial contract work he'd been doing for years. I guess they notice you too, Marcus said, shaking his hand. Guess kindness has a way of finding its way back around, Curtis said, even when you're not looking for it to. Marcus thought about that for the rest of the day. How a small, unremarkable moment of kindness, offered without any expectation return, had somehow made its way full circle, closing a loop he hadn't even realized was open. It wasn't luck. He didn't believe in luck. Not really. Not after everything he'd lived through. It was simply what happened, eventually, when you kept choosing to do the right thing even when nobody was watching, and even when doing the right thing had never once guaranteed you anything in return. Grant Kessler's story didn't end in a dramatic firing, a public shaming, or a scene anyone would post online. Real accountability, Marcus had come to believe over the years, rarely looks like the satisfying spectacle people imagine when they picture justice. After being removed from the facilities division's hiring process, Kessler spent several months in the bias awareness training Diane had required, initially, by his own later admission to a colleague, resentful of the process, convinced he was being unfairly singled out for doing his job the way he'd always done it. But something shifted for him around the fourth month, when the training required him to sit down and personally review the exit interviews and hiring rejection patterns Diane had pulled, not in the abstract, but with names, dates, and specific language he himself had used to reject qualified candidates in 15-minute interviews. He recognized his own words in transcript after transcript. Not the right fit for a structured corporate environment. Recent experience preferred. Will keep your resume on file. The same phrases, over and over, disproportionately applied to candidates who looked a certain way, came from a certain kind of background, carried a certain kind of resume that didn't fit a mold he'd never actually questioned. He requested a meeting with Diane on his own, several weeks after completing the training. Something Diane later mentioned to Marcus, though she never shared the full details of the conversation out of respect for Kessler's privacy. What she did share was this. Kessler had asked quietly whether there was a way to make amends beyond training, whether he could personally reach out to some of the candidates he dismissed too quickly over the past several years, to at least offer them a second, fairer look. Diane allowed it cautiously. Several of those candidates, including two skilled tradespeople with backgrounds strikingly similar to Marcus's own, were eventually brought back for genuine interviews, this time conducted jointly with someone from Marcus's team, ensuring hands-on experience was properly weighed alongside paperwork. One of them, a woman named Patrice Odom, who had run her own electrical contracting business for 9 years before rejection nearly identical to Marcus's, was hired into the facilities division 6 months later. She became, within a year, one of the crew's most respected members. Kessler remained with the company, in a reduced hiring capacity, closely supervised, required to co-conduct every technical role interview alongside someone with actual field experience going forward. It wasn't redemption exactly. Marcus never fully trusted him, and he didn't pretend to, but it was accountability that produced something better than punishment alone ever could have. It changed the outcome for the next person walking into that lobby. You could hold a grudge against him forever, Diane told Marcus once, almost testing the thought out loud. Nobody would blame you. I'm not interested in holding a grudge, Marcus said. I'm interested in making sure the next person who looks like me doesn't get 11 minutes and a closed door. If he actually changed how he sees people, that matters more to me than whether he ever apologizes to my face. He never did receive a personal apology from Kessler. Not directly, not in so many words. But 18 months later, Marcus learned through Patrice that Kessler had personally recommended her for a leadership development program within the company, the kind of quiet advocacy nobody demands credit for. It was enough. Marcus had learned a long time ago that waiting for someone to say sorry the exact way you wanted them to say it was its own kind of trap. What mattered was whether the world got a little fairer because of what happened. And by that measure, something real had shifted. A year to the day after the incident in the lobby, Marcus stood in the same space, waiting for Nia to finish a school project meeting nearby, so he could pick her up on his way home. An ordinary Tuesday, nothing dramatic about it, which was, in its own quiet way, the entire point. The lobby looked the same. The marble floor still gleamed under the same lights. The revolving doors still spun with the same soft mechanical hum. But everything about how Marcus stood in that space had changed. The new security protocols meant no guard would ever again stop someone based on a vague description broadcast over radio. A framed photo near the elevator bank, part of a new employee recognition wall Diane had introduced, included a picture of the facility's crew at their department picnic that summer. Ruth, Torres, Devin, Curtis, Patrice, and Marcus at the center, all of them laughing at something just out of frame. Employees who passed in the lobby now greeted him by name, not out of formality, but familiarity, the kind of recognition that gets built slowly, one honest interaction at a time, exactly the way he'd built trust with his crew. Nia came bounding out of the elevator a few minutes later, backpack half slung over one shoulder, clutching a folder of drawings from her after-school art program, which Marcus's new salary and schedule had finally allowed her to join. "Guess what?" she said, breathless. "Ms. Alvarez said my drawing might get picked for the school hallway display." "Which one?" Marcus asked, already smiling. She flipped through the folder and pulled one out. A drawing, more detailed now than the one she used to make, of a man in a yellow hard hat standing beside a little girl on a bench, sunlight coming through tall glass windows behind them. Across the top, in handwriting steadier now than it had been a year earlier, she'd written, "You don't lose until you stop trying." Marcus felt something catch in his throat. "That's the one from your bag," Nia said. "The interview day. I remembered it, so I drew it again, but better this time." "It's perfect the way it is," Marcus said, crouching down to hug her right there in the lobby. The same lobby where, exactly 1 year earlier, a stranger's hand had closed around his bag strap, while a crowd of strangers watched, certain of something about him that had never once been true. He thought, in that moment, about how close that day had come to breaking something in him. Not his composure, which he'd learned long ago never surrender in public, but his belief that patience and integrity still meant something in a world that so often rewarded neither. It had come close, but it hadn't broken. And now, a year later, standing in the same spot with his daughter's hand in his, a stable job behind him, a crew who trusted him, and a company slowly and perfectly, but genuinely becoming better because of choices he'd made without ever expecting credit for them, Marcus understood something he tried, gently, to pass on to Nia every single day. Goodness doesn't always get noticed right away. Sometimes it gets ignored for a long time. Sometimes it gets mistaken for something else entirely. Stopped at the door, questioned in front of a crowd of strangers. But it is never wasted. That evening, after dinner, after homework, after a particular quiet ritual of braiding Nia's hair for bed, even though she was old enough now to mostly do it herself, Marcus sat on the edge of her bed while she settled under the covers. "Did you have a good day, Daddy?" she asked, the same question she'd asked him every night for years, through the worst of them and now through better ones too. Marcus thought about the lobby a year ago. He thought about Grant Kessler's 11 minutes, and the guard's hand on his bag, and the 10 seconds of a wrong number phone call that had nearly stopped his heart. He thought about Diane running across a marble floor toward a stranger she didn't yet understand, and Curtis's grin in a maintenance corridor, and Devin's certification ceremony, and Ruth's quiet notes left on the maintenance log, and a policy that now protected families across an entire company because he'd been brave enough to ask for it. "I had a really good day," he said. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't softening the truth for her sake. He meant it completely. "Because of the drawing?" she asked sleepily. "Because of a lot of things," he said. "But mostly because of you." She smiled, already half asleep, her hand finding his way it always did, small fingers curling around his callous ones. "Love you, Daddy. Love you more, baby." He sat there a while longer after her breathing even out into sleep, the hallway light casting a soft line across the floor, the framed photo on her dresser, Renee, smiling, taken the summer before everything changed, catching the light just slightly. He thought about the note still folded in the drawer of his nightstand, the one she'd slipped into his bag over a year ago now, the one he still hadn't been able to throw away. Because some things you keep not because you need them anymore, but because they remind you of exactly who you were when you needed them most. Good luck, Daddy. Even if they say no, you're still the best dad in the whole world. He had needed those words on the worst morning of that year. He didn't need them the same way anymore. But he kept them close all the same, because a father never really stops carrying the things his child once gave him to get through a hard day. Outside, the city kept moving the way it always did. Buses running late, elevators rising and falling behind glass windows, strangers walking past each other without knowing a single thing about who they'd just passed. Somewhere in that city was another struggling father, walking home after another rejection, wondering if anyone would ever look closely enough to see what he was actually worth. Marcus hoped, quietly, the way he hoped for most things now, that somebody would, because he had learned, in the hardest year of his life, that it only takes one person choosing to look a little closer, one CEO glancing down from a balcony instead of walking past, one moment of composure chosen instead of anger, one child's note tucked into a bag at exactly the right time, to change absolutely everything. Goodness may be ignored for a while, but it is never wasted.